I'm just going to use the first half of the lectionary reading for this week. The second half would merit a reflection on its own as Jesus sends out his disciples two by two in order to go around the villages and proclaim the gospel. But this first part, I think, also merits reflection in its own right. So from Mark chapter 6 and verses 1 to 6. From there he went to his hometown, accompanied by his disciples. When the Sabbath came, he began to teach in the synagogue, and the large congregation who heard him asked in amazement, "Where does he get it from? What is this wisdom he has been given? How does he perform such miracles? Is he not the carpenter, the son of Mary, the brother of James and Joses and Judas and Simon? Are not his sisters here with us?" So they turned against him. Jesus said to them, "A prophet never lacks honor except in his hometown, among his relations, and his own family." And he was unable to do any miracle there, except that he put his hands on a few sick people and healed them. And he was astonished at their want of faith. A story of a failed mission. Although I have to say, in our own experience, if our mark of failure was that only a few sick people were healed by our touch, then maybe we'd have a slightly different view. But Mark tells this as a story of failure. I was involved in a meeting this week in preparation for General Assembly, our United Reformed Church General Assembly, which happens next weekend. And as those who will be representing Yorkshire Synod, we met to look at some of the resolutions, some of the papers that would be presented, and to talk about them in advance and to make our own preparations. There was one particular item, I won't tell you what it is because that's not particularly relevant, but where somebody expressed a view, a slightly critical view of what was being presented, and then somebody else similarly gave a similar response. And very quickly it became all around the room that actually we were thinking in very much the same way and had very much the same reactions, and we wanted to challenge what was being presented in a very similar way. We were speaking with one voice. And it'll be interesting to see when we are gathered in a large congregation of General Assembly next weekend with people from all course around the country with different perspectives, whether similarly that large congregation will speak with one voice. We'll wait and see. And when that happens, of course, our inclination will be, particularly within the United Reformed Church and the particular traditions we come from, that when we meet in council, when we gather together prayerfully, there is something of the Spirit. And in fact, often we use the procedure by which we try to arrive at consensus. What is the Spirit saying to us? How can we find that common ground where God's call seems to be clear to us? That seems to me a very admirable way to progress, and one that we'd want to hold on to very tightly within our tradition. But the passage we have before us today does, of course, bring a warning. Because here is a large congregation, Mark tells us, but that speaks very much with one voice, and it's one voice that speaks against Jesus, that rejects Jesus. And I know it's of course in the storyteller's technique here, but that literally the congregation seems to speak with one voice when it says, where does he get it from? What is this wisdom he's been given? How does he perform such miracles? Is he not the carpenter's son? Etc. Now, of course, in the real world, that will be in a whole load of little whispered conversations and gossips and asides, and maybe as people go home and they're sharing their thoughts. But nonetheless, all that adds up to a sense that the large crowd is speaking with one voice. It has made up its mind. And that mind is based so much on expectation. And that word expectation, I think, is key to this passage. That here is a congregation that has no expectation that from amongst its own midst will be someone who could bring a word that challenged them in quite the way that Jesus did. There's a specific comment here, maybe, on how it is in our all kinds of ministry that although sometimes it can be appropriate, often within the life of the church we do need the outside voice in order to challenge us. There's always a danger in just simply being a closed group, a closed family, which only ever speaks to itself and affirms its own opinions, and therefore goes around in a circle in a bubble of shared thought. In the life of the church, it has often been my experience that the most profound moments of discovering God's voice, God's challenge to the church, is in the outsider, and how important it is always to listen to that voice when we have opportunity, to invite that voice in, to hear the lone voice, the single voice that may be just speaking the truth that we need to hear. So my invitation is to take this passage at this time and just encourage us to reflect on what it means to be not just individual disciples, but a congregation of disciples. How it is that we do discern the voice of Jesus, the call of the Spirit in our midst, and how we are careful to open up our expectations and to be ready for the surprises, for the lead that comes from the unexpected place, from the voice that is not the voice that we were maybe necessarily expecting to hear. For our God is always a God of surprises, who has a rather regular habit of using the outsider to bring his truth, God's truth, to bear.